All right, so this is part 2, World War II. We finished the battles a bit last time, so I have a little bit more to do into the conferences, and we're going to look at nuclear warfare on this second lecture. Okay, these essential questions should be the same as last time. And we're going to keep asking this question repeatedly. Who is to blame for the Cold War? Both long-term and short-term causes and effects. How do the Paris Peace conferences contribute to the Cold War tensions? And describe the technological developments of World War II. Finally, what marks the actual start of the Cold War? For a war that officially never heats up, how do you mark the beginning of it? Okay, so picking up where we left off, we talked about the Battle of the Bulge, where Hitler was trying to push the German troops back into France and consolidate more of that land, especially after the storming of Normandy Beach. And that, because he fails so desperately, the Battle of Berlin takes place where the USSR troops are able to take over Berlin, and that eventually leads to Hitler's rapid suicide by cyanide. That leaves us with the Eastern Front and the USSR. So on the Eastern Front, we have Japan occupying all of the Pacific Islands, which can be really a long-term battle with all of the island hopping that's having to take place in order to control that area, but also what to do with the USSR, which we've decided to friend at this moment. All right, so this leads us to Potsdam in August of 1945. FDR dies, and that's going to change the entire political structuring post-World War II as Harry Truman takes over. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an understanding of Truman's personality because it is in stark contrast with FDR. You can think of FDR as kind of more of a realpolitik type person, whereas Truman is slightly more Weltpolitik. And here's an example of what I mean. And this is from The Cold War's Killing Field from Paul Chamberlain, which you guys are going to read. So he says, in 1941, as millions of Russians were being slaughtered by the Germans, a junior senator from Missouri had suggested that the United States sit back and feed the flames of war in Europe. And this is his quote. If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And in that way, let them kill as many of each other as possible. That junior senator, Harry Truman, is now the President of the United States. The first atom bomb is detonated in July, and Truman only knew about the atomic bomb immediately after FDR's death and didn't know about the development of the Manhattan Project before that time. There's also going to be a level of instability going into Potsdam as Churchill is replaced by Attlee due to some arguments over Poland. Now, those arguments over Poland are not just like minimal arguments. That's actually kind of an insulting way to put it. It's due to the Katyn massacre, among other major mass murder, I don't even know what to call it, profiles. So essentially, Stalin is getting rid of the opposition and Eastern Europeans who are fighting his acquisition over those lands, and he has them dig their own graves. He has them murdered, and again, just keeps throwing them in. To this day, they're still excavating some of these lands, and the Russians continue to argue whether those graves are the fault of the USSR. All right, so only Stalin is present at Yalta, and the new guys have a hard time evicting Stalin out of the Eastern European territories, especially since it was the Red Army that liberated those countries in the first place. The UK wants to be done with war. Russia only wants to continue the war with Japan to get back the losses from the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, but everyone except for the United States is lacking the manpower and wants a return to peace. This causes complete chaos, especially politically. Stalin wants control of Eastern Europe, and the Western Allies can't tell him no. No one but the United States is wanting to continue the war with Japan, so the entire region, including Poland, is falling quickly to the communist hold in order to avoid a civil war. 4 days after Potsdam, the U.S. drops Little Boy. 1 week after, it's going to be dropping a big man on Nagasaki. The Potsdam Agreement on August 12, 1945, deals directly with the German demilitarization and the new post-war German government and demanding of the Japanese surrender. So they know that the war is coming to an end, and now it's just a matter of how to structure both Germany and Japanese peace. Now, I want you to compare this directly with the Treaty of Versailles because you're going to see some changes, some amendments to the Treaty of Versailles, but you're also going to see some things carry over between the two. You need to be ready to compare both Potsdam, the Treaty of Versailles, and then later the Paris Peace Treaties. Now, Germany is going to be divided into 4 different military zones. I'll show you a picture of those here soon. France is going to be in the southwest, Britain in the northwest, the United States is going to occupy more in the south, and the Soviet Union is going to get the entire east. They are also going to get access to Berlin because in the eastern area, that is pretty much the financial capital of Germany. Now, the Oder-Neisse line, and again, I'll show you that in a second, is a border between Germany and Poland. What this means is that the USSR wins Poland. So remember that Nazi-Soviet pact and the secret protocols, the secret agreements. I consider that pretty successful for the USSR and pretty terrible for the Polish population. Anything east is now communist. Anything west is going to be capitalist, which is going to draw on the NATO agreements, which we will talk about all throughout the rest of this Cold War unit. They are also going to destroy all of the military manufacturing plants, but this is a little bit misleading because it isn't a full destroying. On the eastern side in Germany, they are going to restructure a lot of those for their own capacity for the USSR to have different military machines for their so-called communism in one country. On the western side, that's where you're going to get the creation of factories that were being used for airplanes is now going to be used for cars, BMW. Now, the Allied Control Council is the Allied supreme authority over Germany. It's a joint control over the area where the Allies are promising to cooperate in their control over their 3 regions over Germany. This is later going to cause the Berlin crisis and, of course, later the creation of the Berlin Wall. All right, so here you can see the Oder-Neisse line. Anything west of the Oder-Neisse is going to be capitalist and very intentionally so, and everything west or east is going to be communist, and that's going to be part of the Comintern. All right, so here's the declaration regarding the defeat of Germany and the assumption of the supreme authority by Allied powers. This is the actual agreement that was signed. The governments of the United States of America, the USSR, and the UK, and the provisional government of the French Republic hereby assume supreme authority with respect to Germany, including all the powers possessed by the German government, the High Command, and any state, municipal, or local government or authority. The assumption for the purposes stated above of the said authority and powers does not affect the annexation of Germany. Therefore, they are not allowed to consider Germany a colony, which the USSR essentially does, which we're going to get to later, and instead is supposed to be more of a cooperative agreement. They are trying to make sure that they don't have the same situation that happened before, where Germany can quickly create its own government that is led by military leaders and usurp the agreements post-war. Okay, so I want you to stop. You guys have a chart where you can compare and contrast the different conferences and what each one of them gains. Do they get what they want? How is that going to grow tensions? So I want you to just take some time, go back to the old lecture notes, go through these lecture notes, and then you also have the reading that is posted on Schoology that you can also go through. It's really nicely labeled, so you can kind of just go through those bullets and see what each country wanted and fill that out. I will be collecting that at the beginning of class next hour. I also want you to keep in mind what mistakes did they fix from Versailles in these conferences, and what are some mistakes or some improvements that were able to carry over between the different treaties. All right, so we're going to take a little sidestep here. Nuclear warfare. How did we get to this point, and why does it become such a spearheaded development going into the Cold War? So essentially we have the Manhattan Project, which was originally funded by the fear of other countries creating an atom bomb. This is not an unfunded fear, as it is discovered very quickly under Hitler's Germany that he is trying to create nuclear capacity, and he does want to create some sort of a nuclear weapon. He is not able to do so, thank goodness, because it is pretty terrifying to think what he would have done had he been able to achieve that level of technology. In 1940, the U.S. funds the development by a team led by Robert Oppenheimer. Now, the Potsdam Declaration demands that Japan surrenders or faces prompt and utter destruction, but it is not declared what that prompt and utter destruction looks like. And instead is kind of left up into the open. At the time, before Truman even becomes president, he doesn't know that some sort of a bomb is even created that could annihilate Japan from the war in the first place. So the original idea is called Operation Downfall. It's suggested by General Eisenhower and General Douglas MacArthur, who is later going to be fired by Truman, which is also a fun story. We'll get to that later. And they suggest that the only way to end the operations in Japan is through a continued bombing rate of Japan, which could cost possibly 1 million United States lives, as you have to island hop all along the Pacific in order to end the occupation of those territories. Now, Truman wants a quick end to the war, and his major focus is dominating with a U.S. supremacy in post-war politics. So James Burns, the Secretary of State, suggests the atomic bomb. Hiroshima, in August 6th of 1945, flattens 90% of the overall city. This dome still remains as a memorial if you go and you visit it, if you visit today. The rest of the city was rebuilt around this dome. It was a manufacturing center, so that was essentially why it was picked over Tokyo. It's 500 miles from Tokyo, but they wanted to make sure that they could stifle the manufacturing capacity of the city without necessarily killing all the civilians that would have been devastated through Tokyo. So it was a very tragic threat, I guess. And the bomb that was dropped was named Little Boy. Now that video, I have it posted on the Edpuzzle as well, and it's just a super short 3-minute video where you can actually see footage of this bomb being dropped. Okay, so in August of 1945, and for some time, very long after, Truman regrets to some degree dropping this bomb because he worries so deeply about the cost that it had on American sentiments, and then also on the women and children of Japan. So in my low technology way of being, forgive me, here's a video of Truman speaking.
Dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work.
All right. Okay, so Nagasaki happens on August 9th, 1945. 40,000 people are instantly killed. The reason, even though it was a bigger bomb named Fat Man, even it didn't have as much devastation, was because it's a mountainous city and it was limited in its ability to expand due to the canyons. Emperor Hirohito on August 15, 1945, announces unconditional surrender from the devastating power of a new and most cruel bomb. He is not truly reprimanded for the actions under World War II and is going to be able to maintain his power for multiple decades thereafter. Okay, so a little bit of information about the atomic bombs themselves and the pilots. The Enola Gay is a B-29 Superfortress, which pilot Paul Tibbets, named after his mother, and which had been stripped of everything but the necessities so as to be thousands of pounds lighter than an ordinary plane of that same make and model. In 1945, it was given an important task, and this is a direct quote from Tibbets. It was just like any other mission. Some people are reading books, some are taking naps, but when the bomb left the airplane, the plane jumped because you just released 10,000 pounds. Theodore Van Kirk, the plane's navigator, later recalls, immediately Tibbets took the airplane to a 180-degree turn. We lost 2,000 feet on that turn and ran away as fast as we could. Then it exploded. All we saw in the airplane was a bright flash. Shortly after that, the first shock wave hit us and the plane snapped all over. The Trinity Jumbo was 28 feet long, 12 feet by 8 inches in diameter with steel walls that were up to 16 inches thick in certain places. So a lot of the thought went into the way of containing that 15-pound plutonium core of the bomb that in case the 5,300 pounds of conventional high explosives surrounding the core exploded without it setting off a nuclear blast. And in the process, it would have scattered the plutonium, which cost about $250 million worth across the desert during its tests. Therefore, the biggest fear in creating the jumbo was the ability to move it without causing mass explosions. All right, so this leads to the nuclear arsenals and the official buildup over time. This is going to be a major point of contention throughout the Cold War. It's the United States that is able to detonate the first atomic bomb, and it is later followed by China in 1964. What you're looking at right here is a Nevada test site. Yes, those are real people. Most of them are young teenage boys up to boys in their 20s who are paid small amounts of money to go with a paper and a pencil and a little helmet and watch from afar to see what happens. And later they didn't know at the time, but they were considered test subjects by the American government to see what happens when someone experiences an atomic bomb. Does it scare them half to death? Do they have later health issues, whatever? And a lot of those people that you're looking at do end up dying of cancer and some other terrible things. There are 2 of these test sites that are located in Colorado, but the long-term impact when we're looking at technology is how this sets off the space race and the development of ICBM technology that's going to get us into the Cold War. The USSR is going to be the first to create an ICBM with Sputnik that was launched in 1957. Okay, so again, just a little pause and reflect because we're looking at the long-term implications of both World War II and the Potsdam conferences, but also of the Cold War itself. So let's look at nuclear energy. A nuclear power plant is a thermal power station in which the heat source is a nuclear reactor. As is typical of thermal power stations, heat is used to generate steam, and that steam drives a steam turbine connected to the generator that produces electricity. As of 2014, the International Atomic Energy Agency reports that there are 450 nuclear power reactors in operation in 31 countries. I found that number really surprising because of how dangerous they are with like 3 Mile Island and of course Chernobyl. June 27, 1954 is the world's first nuclear power station to be created in the USSR. Later in England, they're going to open up a fully operable power station in 1956. Now, the Chernobyl disaster, which you can watch on TV if you're interested, was a nuclear accident that occurred on Saturday, the 26th of April in 1986. I was 2 years old. At the number 4 nuclear reactor in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near the city in the north of Ukraine. And what happened was the reactor had design flaws and there was a breach of the protocol during a simulated power outage. So they were trying to conduct a safety test and it actually ended up melting down, which caused 42 deaths. Now, again, this leads to those kind of long-term implications of right now we need cleaner energy. Is nuclear power potentially the way to do it? Is there a way to do it more safely? Okay, back what we were doing. The Paris Peace Treaties is the final Paris Peace Conference in 1946 following Potsdam that is going to officially end World War II. Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Finland are all sovereign states for like 20 minutes until the USSR takes over. Italy is the only one that is going to be able to maintain its sovereign status. The creation of the United Nations is on October 24th, 1945, and that is replacing the failure of the League of Nations that essentially allowed the buildup of Hirohito, Mussolini, Franco, and of course Hitler. They are focusing first and foremost on the ability to create a war machine that is controlled by all of the different countries. We're going to see the after effects of this, especially when we get to Korea here pretty soon, because even though it is the UN military council that is in control of the forces in the UN, it's 80% United States troops. The UN is headquartered today in New York City. So if you were watching a few weeks ago on that UN conference, it was in New York City with all the protests and everything surrounding it. But the charter itself was signed in San Francisco along with a lot of the Paris Peace Treaties. Now, the big focus, and this is what I was referring to earlier with the comparison and contrast between the Treaty of Versailles and Potsdam and now The Paris Peace Conference are those war reparations. It's the Soviet Union that wants the most money paid this time, not France. And actually, they are really worried about those war reparations causing another Hitler to be able to rise up, hence where we get the Bretton Woods Agreement. Try and keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and tie them to yourself financially so that they're less likely to declare war. While the Soviet Union wants the most money paid, and this is essentially going to lead to the Berlin crisis, it's Italy that ends up paying the highest fine. They also undersign a commitment to Wilson's desire from World War I of minority rights, freedom of speech, religion, safety of self regardless of gender. Later, that's also going to be sexual preference. And they want a commitment to prevent the resurgence of fascist governments. All right, so this one I find kind of confusing just in the name. The Federal Republic of Germany is created on May 23rd of 1949. The Federal Republic of Germany is the capitalist side. That's the Allied control area known as West Germany. You can think of it as mimicked under the UK parliamentary capitalist economy side, and it's Konrad Adenauer is the leader of the West. Now, on the other side, and this is why I find this confusing because it's opposite from what you might think, the German Democratic Republic is the Commies. So, Democratic Commies. Got it. Okay, so this is going to cause the breakdown of reparations, and again, I keep referring to that Berlin crisis, and the first step is the Berlin blockade. In 1946, the Soviet Union and the Allied powers cannot agree on reparations. Remember, the Soviet Union is the one that wants all the money paid back to them because, after all, this war wasn't their fault due to the Nazi-Soviet pact and the secret Polish protocol. So the Allied powers aren't able to agree with them, and so they decide to merge the French, British, and U.S. control zones in 1947, and they even create a new currency in 1948 that officially ties those Allied portions of West Germany together. The USSR is going to fear this combined power, and they respond with a blockade over Berlin, not allowing the Allied powers to access Berlin. The Allied powers then respond to this Berlin blockade using air power by airlifting all kinds of supplies in, and they get to the point where they can lift any supplies that they need, that they even start sending candy just to show a sign of cockiness. 1961. All right, so these social impacts of the war are unbelievably great, and especially when you are comparing this to World War I. There's an estimated $10 billion worth of technological innovations that are stolen from Germany by the United States and the UK a few years after the war, but it is the Red Army that is accused of rape and murder. As high as 2 million rape victims are accusing the USSR of repeat occurrences. This full occupation of Germany is going to have the long-term displacement of Germans, and the impact overall that the UN tries to respond with is the Nuremberg trials. But it's something that we need to ask ourselves, can a punishment adequately reflect the crime, especially over time, and especially when you have the parties that are giving out the punishment are not necessarily without blood on their hands either, USSR. So the USSR has the biggest impact financially, which is why they are demanding the largest form of reparations. 23% of their land is now unusable for farming, which leads to a food crisis of 1946 to 47. 17,000 towns, 31,000 factories, 100,000 state farms are destroyed. Cadres, remember Fitzpatrick. European coal production is down by 40% at the end of the war, and the United States has loaned over $50 billion in aid through the Lend-Lease program, $31 billion to the UK, $11 billion to the USSR, and everybody wants those loans forgiven. Because of this loan, because of the US capacity to industrialize quickly, the GDP doubles. I'm going to show you exactly what that means here in a second, though. So 50 to 80 million people are killed with high civilian rates. Again, I've talked about this in the past. I hate numbers like this. To just have an estimate of between having a missing 30 million human lives, it's kind of disgraceful. Okay, so the US GDP I find interesting just to look at because everybody throws around these numbers quite often when you're looking at the United States in war. 1938, our rate of growth was down by 3.3%, but that's the end of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. By 1940, we start increasing our defense spending, but that's the beginning more of the Lend-Lease program. So our rate of growth goes up by 8.8% as we are trying to help out the Allied powers. By the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we are up by 17%. But by 1946, we're down with Truman's budget cuts immediately following the war by 11.6. Now take those and you still have a rate of growth by over 6%, and that was, if you take the negative growth, you're looking at a potential 9% rate of growth overall. Now this is not sustainable, and we're actually going to enter a series of recessions from here on out. All right, so the United States and USSR emerge as main superpowers after World War II. Why? Well, one, the U.S. Air Force strength is so large, the U.S. policy of open trade, of open borders, and the U.S. now has a strong GDP after the world gives them the strength and to create and maintain stability in Europe. It is the United States that's going to emerge as the overall stabilizer of the world due to their ability to grow their industry quickly. On the other hand, the USSR stabilizes the small Eastern European nations that formed after the war. Now, this may seem kind of ironic because they took over those and created satellite states that are communist, but it does avoid the emergence of the civil wars that are starting to rupture immediately following World War II. They stabilize that region. I wouldn't say that it's a good human rights effort, though. And overall, there's a triumph over fascism. Fascism is bad, and it's worse than communism, and capitalism obviously is going to win in its own right. Now we're just going to have the division of Europe and Asia in the two camps between capitalism and communism. Now finally, Stalin's Red Army is the one that finally dealt the final blow to Hitler's Nazis, and it's that military strength and the prestige that's built into that win, and it's going to help build up Stalin's cult of personality, which is also going to help create Mao's personality and the Sino-Soviet pacts in the Cold War era. Communism overall is going to fill that power vacuum in the East due to that military strength and the ability to create a Comintern to stabilize the economy with the 5-year plans and the cooperation with the USSR. Again, this seems a little positive. Don't get me wrong. It's not. We'll get there. All right, so who's to blame for the Cold War overall? Make sure that you can argue this from multiple different angles, not just individual countries, but also the team efforts between the Axis, the Allies, USSR, and beyond. Long-term plus short-term consequences, and that really helps bring us into the Paris Peace Conferences and the Potsdam Conference that contributed to those Cold War tensions. Make sure that you can compare and contrast Versailles and how they were able to grow and maintain part of the treaties of Versailles, and how they completely overhauled certain areas, for example, the League of Nations to the United Nations. Make sure that you can compare and contrast, describe the technological developments of World War II. It doesn't really do a lot of good to make it stand on its own, though, if you don't really know the overall implications. And I would go long-term with this as well, being able to describe those technological developments long-term. How does this create Cold War tensions, nuclear competition, ICBM technology, and again, we're going to get there further as well. Is there a way to mark the start of the Cold War? My friend Paul Chamberlain would say yes, and we're going to get here soon, but I want you to start thinking about, is it Potsdam? Is it before? Is it later? To be continued.